You really think someone with a face like that should be serving people? The words hit like a slap across the diner floor at Maple Creek, slicing through the morning stillness. The man sneered as his eyes lingered on the scar running from Isabella Reyes's left ear across her jaw. She didn't look away. She didn't even blink. Instead, she replied with quiet steel, "I've served people like you before, but in places where bullets did more than bruise egos." By the next morning, everything had changed. A line of Marines stretched down the sidewalk outside the diner, each one holding a small object wrapped in cloth. Who were they waiting for? And why was the woman mocked just yesterday now being honored like a hero? The words dropped like a thunderclap, cutting through the morning hush like a gunshot in church. You really think someone with a face like that should be serving people? The diner froze. Forks paused midair. A coffee cup trembled in a waitress's hand. Outside, birds chirped in the sleepy dawn, but inside the Maple Creek diner, time stopped. She didn't respond right away. She just looked at him, eyes steady, unblinking, scarred. In that split second before her lips even moved, there was a weight to her silence, a gravity that pulled at the hearts of everyone around her. Her voice when it came was low, steady, measured. "I've served people like you before, but in places where bullets did more than bruise egos." The man blinked. No one laughed. No one backed him up. Only the sound of sizzling bacon and a dripping coffee pot filled the stunned silence. That morning, Isabella Reyes wasn't just a waitress. She was a battlefield holding a coffee pot, and her war was far from over. But what none of them knew was that by the next morning, the same booth where she was mocked would be surrounded by Marines in civilian clothes holding small objects wrapped in cloth. Some would carry photos. Some would carry dog tags. One would carry a medal she had earned but never accepted, and all of them would come for her. If you're hearing this and your heart already feels a pull, like something more is buried beneath the scars, then stay. Because what's about to unfold isn't just a story. It's a reckoning of dignity, of memory, of what happens when the forgotten are finally remembered. But before we take another step, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. These are the stories that don't always make the headlines, but they should, and with your support, we'll keep telling them. Now let me take you back. Maple Creek Diner sat tucked between a hardware store and a pawn shop on the edge of Savannah, Georgia. Its windows fogged from the inside every morning as coffee brewed and biscuits baked in an ancient oven that clanged like it resented being woken up so early. Inside, regulars found solace in routine. The same booths, the same conversations, the same woman always there before sunrise. Isabella Reyes had become part of the wallpaper. Not because she was forgettable, but because she moved with such quiet consistency. She poured coffee like a ritual. She knew who wanted extra creamer and who preferred their toast just shy of burnt. She also knew how to disappear, which is what you learned to do after war, but you couldn't ignore her face. The scars, thin but deep, traced down from her left ear across her jawline, disappearing beneath her collar, only to reappear on her forearms when sleeves were rolled up in the Savannah heat. Some were smooth like healed fractures. Others jagged, angry memories carved in skin. People didn't ask, at least not out loud. They made assumptions, murmured theories between sips of sweet tea. Car crash, house fire, maybe drugs. She heard them all. She just never answered. Her silence was not weakness, it was survival. Then came that Tuesday. 3 out-of-town consultants, too polished for this part of Savannah, strutted into the diner, laughing too loud. They chose the corner booth like it was a throne. One wore a Rolex that caught the light. Another had slicked back hair and a Bluetooth headset still blinking blue. When Isabella approached with menus, the tallest of them didn't even glance at the menu. He glanced at her, and that's when he said it. "You really think someone with a face like that should be up front?" The air thickened, like a storm building behind every breath. The kitchen went silent, even the radio fizzled into static. A trucker at the counter shifted in his seat. An elderly woman with a hearing aid leaned in closer, eyes wide. Isabella stood still, not from shock, but because she'd heard worse and had survived it. She placed the menus on the table, poured coffee with a hand that barely trembled, and met his gaze head-on. "I've served people like you before," she said, "but in places where the danger was real and the cowards didn't wear ties." The man chuckled, trying to regain control. You military, he scoffed. With that face, you wouldn't make it past the parking lot. His companions laughed, but quieter now. Even they could sense the shift. A young waitress near the counter bit her lip. The trucker stood abruptly, slapped a $20 bill on the table, and walked out without another word. No one followed him. They were too busy watching Isabella, who in that moment became something larger than herself. Mrs. Lane, the diner's owner, stepped out from the kitchen, drying her hands on her apron. You don't have to take their table, she whispered to Isabella. Isabella smiled, not out of kindness, but out of control. No. Let me. Some people just fear what they can't understand. She turned and walked away, back straight, unshaken. But the truth was, the tremble didn't show in her hands. It showed later in the quiet way she folded napkins tighter than usual. In the small pause before taking the next order. The man thought he had made her small, but he hadn't realized. You can't shrink a woman who's already stood through fire, and he couldn't possibly know that his insult would trigger something extraordinary, that the next day dozens of people would line up to honor her, and that her scars, once hidden behind coffee pots and routine, would become symbols of survival, visible not just on her skin, but in the lives of those she had saved. Question for the comments. If someone stood up for you after years of silence, would it mean more than words ever could? A. Yes, recognition after pain means everything. B. No, I don't need recognition to know my worth. Comment your answer below. A or B, and tell us why. The body forgets many things, but the skin remembers. It remembers fire. It remembers pressure. It remembers the pain of metal against bone and heat that lingers long after the flames are gone. For Isabella Reyes, the scars running along her jaw and arms were not a mark of weakness. They were a silent record of courage in the face of chaos. Long before she poured coffee into chipped mugs, Isabella had poured blood from wounds that weren't hers. She had wrapped bandages around trembling limbs, administered morphine with steady hands, and whispered comfort to dying soldiers in a language made not of words but of presence. Her battlefield was not a story she told, not over hash browns and early morning specials. It lived in flashes, in the whistle of the coffee machine that sometimes mimicked the eerie hum of a helicopter blade, in the metallic clatter of a dropped spoon that brought back the rattle of an exploding Humvee. Years ago, before she was just the waitress with the scars, Isabella was known as Staff Sergeant Reyes, Field Medic, with Echo Company 2nd Battalion 8th Marines. She served 2 tours in Afghanistan. The second one nearly took her life. It had started with a routine convoy through the Thanhk district, a road like any other, the kind of dust that clings to your teeth. Then a thunderous crack, a flash. The vehicle behind hers erupted in a bloom of orange and black, lifting off the ground like a paper toy and flipping sideways into a ditch. Screams followed, muffled by smoke, choked by sand. Isabella was the first one out. She ran toward the wreckage without hesitation, boots pounding against the cracked earth, heart slamming against her ribs. She found 2 Marines inside, one unconscious, the other pinned beneath twisted steel, bleeding from his thigh. She didn't wait. Her hands moved faster than thought. She looped a belt into a makeshift tourniquet, then braced her back against a burning doorframe to pull the second Marine free. The heat singed her uniform. The next explosion came before she cleared the blast zone. She flew, concrete fire silence. When she woke in the medevac, she could still feel the blood sticky on her gloves. The last thing she saw before blacking out was the Marine she saved. Giving her a thumbs up, his face smeared with soot, his leg gone but his life intact. They awarded her the Purple Heart, but she didn't attend the ceremony. She was still in a hospital in Germany, jaw wired shut, skin wrapped in gauze, unable to speak. When she returned home, she brought her medals in a shoebox. She never displayed them. They lived under her bed alongside photos she couldn't look at without trembling. Civvy Street was a different kind of war. The interviews were promising on paper. She was punctual, trained, disciplined. But when she walked into a room, she saw it. The scan, eyes tracing her face like a roadmap of something tragic. Customer-facing roles, they said, require a certain look. She stopped applying. It was only by chance she walked past Maple Creek Diner that day. A handwritten sign in the window read, "Help wanted. Punctual, reliable, no drama." She stepped inside, hair pulled low to cover her neck, wearing a turtleneck in July. Mrs. Lane looked up from the register. Her eyes were warm, her voice no nonsense. "You good with eggs and early mornings?" she asked. "I'm better with pressure than most," Isabella replied. Mrs. Lane didn't flinch. "Can you start tomorrow?" No resume, no second glance, just a fresh apron and an unspoken pack work, hard stay steady and leave the rest unsaid. The diner became her refuge. The rhythm of service, the clang of dishes, the hiss of bacon on the griddle was a kind of therapy. Predictable, forgiving. She became a fixture, a quiet part of the early morning machinery. She memorized orders, gave truckers extra napkins, slipped bacon onto kids' plates without charging. She didn't need to be asked to care. Compassion had always been muscle memory. Still, she never spoke about her time in uniform. Not even when Marines from nearby Hunter Army Airfield came in. She'd noticed the haircuts, the boots, the cadence in their speech, but she said nothing. Until one morning, quiet, slow like most others, a group of young Marines came in joking around in civilian clothes. She served them like she served everyone else, respectfully, silently with a faint nod when one said, "Thank you, ma'am." They left without ceremony. But later, clearing table 7, she found something tucked beneath a coffee cup. A napkin, neatly folded. Crisp block letters written in blue ink. "You saved our lieutenant in Thanhk. I remember you, so does he. He still keeps your photo on his desk. CPL Dixon." Isabella stood there, napkin in hand, her breath caught somewhere between ribs and memory. She didn't cry. She folded the napkin again carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket. Her fingers brushed against it often that week, like checking for a heartbeat. She never mentioned it to anyone, but her posture changed. Her steps, once subdued, gained a quiet defiance. Not pride exactly, something more raw, something reclaimed. She hadn't disappeared. Someone remembered. Someone had seen her not just as the woman who poured coffee, but as the woman who once ran into fire. And soon she would learn he wasn't the only one. The next morning broke with a hush too quiet for a diner that usually hummed with the familiar clang of prep pans and the pop of biscuit tins hitting hot trays. But today, before Isabella Reyes could even reach the front door of Maple Creek Diner, the silence had already been shattered. Not by noise, but by the weight of stillness. She stopped short as she turned the corner onto West Bay Street. Her breath caught. Her steps slowed. There was a line, not a casual queue, not a scattered group of early risers hoping for coffee. No, this was different. They stood shoulder to shoulder, dozens of them lined neatly along the sidewalk in the pre-dawn mist. Men and women, broad-backed and silent, many with hair-cropped close jackets, zipped hands gripping something small and wrapped in cloth. They weren't talking. They weren't scrolling phones. They just waited, still, poised, like soldiers standing formation. Isabella's first instinct was confusion, then concern, then something else, a cold ripple down her spine that whispered from memory. She recognized the posture, the stillness that didn't just come from patience but from discipline. These were not strangers. These were Marines. She fumbled slightly with her keys, metal clinking against metal, and pushed open the diner's door. Inside, the familiar chime of the bell sounded brittle in the strange tension of the moment. The lights flickered on. The heat kicked in with a quiet hum. But outside, the crowd stood steady, waiting. At exactly 6 o'clock, she flipped the sign to open, and the door creaked open behind her. The first man to enter walked with the slow assurance of someone who had marched long distances and through heavier storms. His hair was streaked with silver, and the lines around his eyes told stories of both deserts and years. He stepped to the counter, removed his coat, and took a seat. "Coffee," he said. "Black." His voice was low. "Rough. You probably don't remember me," he added almost as an afterthought. Isabella turned to face him fully. Recognition didn't come quickly, but gradually, like dawn creeping across the battlefield. "Captain Ellis," she breathed. He nodded, lips curling into a quiet smile. "Retired now. Been trying to track you down for 10 years. She poured the coffee. Her hand was steady, but her chest rose and fell with the slow tremor of breath held too long. "You saved my life," he said. "Thanhk, Checkpoint Bravo. I was under the radio tower when it collapsed." She swallowed. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I remember. You were bleeding from the chest. I used 2 bandages and a prayer." He chuckled softly. Whatever it was, it worked. I have a wife now, 2 sons. None of them would have existed without that prayer. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a wrapped object. He unfolded the cloth slowly and placed it on the counter. It was a Bravo Company medallion worn and dulled by time. "This belonged to my squad," he said. "You earned it more than any of us." Before Isabella could respond, the door chimed again. Another Marine, then another. They came one by one, men and women, some in boots caked with red dirt, others in pressed dress pants with eyes already moist. Each one brought something: dog tags, letters, pins, patches, photos, mementos of a past that she had buried, but that they had carried with them, waiting for the right moment to return it. Each gift was accompanied by a story. A young woman placed a letter on the counter. "My brother was in your convoy," she said. "He lost his leg. You held his hand until the chopper came. He says you saved his soul more than his body." Another handed her a photo. A younger version of Isabella knelt beside a soldier, her hands crimson, her expression locked in quiet determination. "You kept me breathing when everyone else panicked," he said. One after another they came, until the booths were full and the walls seemed to lean in to listen. Outside, the line stretched farther now down the block around the corner. Local reporters began to appear, cameras slung on shoulders, whispering to each other about the scene unfolding. Word had spread overnight that a woman once mocked for her scars had been recognized for something far deeper. By noon, the diner's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Requests for interviews, donations, pouring in messages from families whose sons and daughters had made it home because of the woman who now refilled their coffee. But Isabella never looked for the camera. Her eyes were always on the next Marine, on the token in their hand, on the words they carried for too long. She wasn't just hearing "thank you," she was being remembered. And with every face, every nod, every silent coin laid on the counter, she realized that her scars were not just wounds, they were witnesses. Witnesses to sacrifice, to survival, to something no enemy could erase. And they had come back not to repay a debt, but to restore her name. That day, the diner didn't just serve breakfast, it served memory, it served justice. And as the sun began to set over Savannah's skyline, streaking orange across the glass, Isabella stood behind the counter, surrounded by a mosaic of gratitude tokens of lives she had touched without ever asking for recognition. She wasn't invisible anymore. She never had been. By dawn the next day, the video had already begun to bloom across the digital landscape, like a field of wildflowers in spring, unexpected, unstoppable, beautiful in its defiance of silence. It started on a single post filmed from across the street, shaky and raw. Isabella Reyes standing in the middle of Maple Creek Diner, her hands full of small cloth-wrapped tokens, her face caught in that delicate balance between disbelief and grace. No caption was needed beyond the truth. She served in silence. Now they speak for her. Within hours, the video was shared thousands of times. By lunchtime, it had gone national. Morning shows mentioned it in passing, evening segments dug deeper. Journalists called it the day the Marines came back. But to those who knew better, it was something holier, a delayed salute to someone who had never asked for one. Outside the diner, the line didn't shrink, it swelled. Veterans from nearby towns drove in, some on motorcycles with unit patches on their sleeves, others in borrowed suits and trembling hands. Families arrived with folded flags, framed photos, and scrapbooks of sons and daughters saved by someone they'd never properly met. And all of them waited, not for food but for closure. Inside, Isabella moved with quiet rhythm. Her hands poured coffee, passed plates, accepted keepsakes. But beneath the movements, a current ran deep, an undertow of emotion she hadn't felt in years. Not since the war, not since the silence. She didn't speak much, but her eyes did. That evening, a letter arrived, hand-delivered, sealed in an official envelope, embossed with the Department of Defense insignia. Mrs. Lane opened the back office and gave her space. Isabella read it once, then again. They wanted her story, not for media, not for spectacle, but for training, an example of courage under fire, of leadership without rank. They were building a module for new Marine recruits, and they asked if they could use her name. At first she hesitated. Then she remembered the faces: young men barely old enough to vote, girls with sunburned noses and polished boots sitting in her diner on Tuesdays, listening, asking, learning. She signed the form, but she added a note in her own handwriting: Tell them the scars are maps, not warnings, not shame, just proof we were there when it mattered. The ripple grew wider. 3 local businesses inspired by the story announced veteran-focused hiring initiatives. A bakery posted a sign, "We honor scars here," seen and unseen. A trucking company updated their logo to include the words, "In service always." Donations poured in for veteran support groups, many addressed simply for Isabella's people. Someone launched a scholarship fund in her name. Within 2 weeks, it raised over $200,000, enough to send 10 veteran medics to nursing school. Isabella donated the entire tip jar that month, quietly slipping her cash into the collection bucket beside the register. When Mrs. Lane asked why, she only said, "They're still learning how to come home. That's harder than it looks." On the 3rd Tuesday, after the Marines had lined up, something new happened. A group of high school students walked in, awkward, fidgeting, led by a teacher with a service pin on his lapel. He had shared Isabella's story in class as part of a unit on modern American history. Now they had come to meet her. One by one, the students handed her folded notes, handwritten, honest, heartbreaking. One read, "My dad never talks about the war, but he cried when he watched your video. He said thank you." Another simply said, "You make scars look strong." Isabella placed the notes in a cigar box she kept under the register. A box filled now with letters, napkins, coins, ribbons, and memories, each one a testament to a life she touched without ever meaning to. The following week, a man walked in wearing a pressed shirt and an uncomfortable expression. He looked smaller than she remembered, less sure, less smug. Michael Landry stood just inside the door holding a wooden box. "I came to apologize," he said, voice cracking. "Not just for the words, for the judgment." He placed the box gently on the counter. Inside was a silver bracelet engraved with 6 words, "To the one who ran toward fire." Isabella didn't speak right away. She studied him, then looked at the bracelet, then back at him. "My daughter saw the video," he added. "She asked me why I was mean to the brave lady. I didn't know what to say." Isabella nodded. "Then maybe this conversation matters more than the one before." He swallowed. "I hope so." As he turned to leave, he dropped an envelope into the donation jar. No words, just motion. Later, it would be discovered to hold $500 and a note that read, "For those still finding their way home." That night, Mrs. Lane pulled Isabella aside. "You could have kept that bracelet," she said, or said no. "I don't need things," Isabella replied. "I need people to change." And they were. The story had grown beyond her now, beyond the diner, beyond Savannah. It had taken root in the hearts of strangers, not because she shouted, but because she had stood her ground without raising her voice. In a world loud with noise, her quiet had made the biggest sound, and it was still echoing. When Isabella Reyes first walked into Maple Creek Diner, she wasn't looking for recognition. She was looking for silence. For a place to work where the clatter of dishes and the repetition of coffee refills might drown out the echoes of a past that few people understood. But fate, it seems, has a habit of making sure the quiet ones are eventually heard. Her story began not with heroics, but with humility. A scarred face, a quiet demeanor, a job done with dignity. She served eggs and hash browns to locals who never asked where the scars came from. And she never offered. Her silence was her armor, her calm, her camouflage. Then came a moment, a single cruel comment from a stranger that pierced through that silence. That moment might have broken someone else, but not Isabella. She didn't fight back with rage. She didn't retreat in shame. She stood her ground and responded not with vengeance, but with truth. "I've served people like you before, but in much harsher conditions." She didn't know that her words would echo beyond the diner walls, that across town a Marine who had once bled on a battlefield would recognize her. That soon a quiet street in Savannah would become the site of a living tribute, a long line of service members, veterans, and families showing up not to eat but to remember. Because Isabella wasn't just a medic in the Marines. She was the reason sons came home, the reason fathers met their newborns, the reason broken bodies had a second chance. And she never asked for thanks. She never raised her hand to say, "I saved lives." She just showed up on the battlefield and later behind a counter. The recognition she received wasn't about medals or ceremonies. It was about something deeper, truth rising to the surface. A reckoning of gratitude long overdue. And in that reckoning, she became something more than a waitress, more than a Marine. She became a symbol of resilience, of humility, of quiet courage in a world addicted to noise. As her story spread, it didn't just change one diner, it changed a town. Hiring practices were reformed. School children learned that heroes aren't always caped or camera ready. A street was renamed. A scholarship was created. Conversations that had been silent for decades about scars, trauma healing began to stir. And Isabella, through it all, remained exactly as she had always been, grounded, grateful, human. She taught first aid classes in the back of the diner. She listened more than she spoke. And every year she made her pilgrimage to the cemetery, not for attention, but for memory, for those she'd left behind. Her message wasn't written on billboards. It was passed hand to hand, story to story. That courage doesn't always look like combat. Sometimes it looks like returning, like surviving when you didn't think you would, like showing up every day and choosing to serve again, even when your war is supposed to be over. So what is the lesson here for you, for me, for all of us still walking through our own battles? It's this. The world often forgets quiet strength. It overlooks those who don't ask for credit. But in truth, it is these people, the Isabella Reyeses of the world, who hold us together when everything else is falling apart. They don't lead with noise. They lead by example. And maybe that's what we need more of right now. In a time when outrage gets clicks and conflict goes viral, stories like Isabella's remind us that compassion is still the greatest form of courage. That service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. That scars, whether visible or hidden, are not signs of failure. They're proof that we stood in the fire and kept moving. You don't have to be a soldier to be brave. You just have to choose integrity when no one's looking. You just have to be willing to help without applause. And you have to remember always that the quietest voices often carry the heaviest truths. So the next time you see someone who moves through the world with unspoken pain or grace, pause before judging. You may be looking at someone who held the line when it mattered most. Here's a question for you. If you had a chance to thank someone who changed your life silently without ever asking for credit, would you A? Yes, I believe even the quietest heroes deserve to be honored. B. No, some acts are meant to remain private even if powerful. Comment below with your answer, A or B, and share your reasoning. Let's learn from each other. And now we want to hear from you. What did Isabella's story teach you about courage, compassion, or justice? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective might inspire someone else reading. And if stories like this matter to you, real stories true, heroes, powerful moments of justice finally served, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us keep sharing the voices that deserve to be heard. Thank you for listening. And remember, some scars are silent medals. And some heroes never needed a spotlight, only a chance to be seen.